My name's Tony G, and I'm very honoured and very pleased to be the current custodian of a very grand old layout called Buckingham, which was built by the late Reverend Peter Denny over a period of years starting in 1947 until he sadly passed away in 2009. The layout came to me shortly after that, and it's now set up in a shed in my back garden, and I'm very happy to have it here and to have friends around for regular operating sessions. The one thing about Buckingham that probably makes it special is, as far as we're aware, it was the first EM gauge layout that sort of appeared in public, and certainly we think it was the first one that was ever exhibited. Everything on the layout is scratch built, barring one or two very minor items, and Peter started just after the war when virtually nothing was available, and if there was anything at all that he wanted on the layout, he found a way to make it himself. And it's lovely that some of these items that are running on the layout today, they're now 70 years old and they're still running just as well as they did the day they were made. When he started out, he had no knowledge or skills, and he was very much self-taught. He taught himself how to use a soldering iron, which in those days initially was a big lump of copper that was heated up on a gas ring. He taught himself how to solder bits of metal together. There were a few commercial components available. He could get hold of wheels, motors and gears. He taught himself how to turn things like chimneys and domes using an old-fashioned hand drill and brace. He taught himself how to cast lead, and he used to make his frames, his mechanisms out of a big block of lead with brass frames bolted to them. So he's very much self-taught. Initially the locos were sort of quite basic, but later on he did go and add other details like brake gear and lamp irons to sort of bring them a little bit more up to date to the sort of modern things that we would have on kit built and scrap built locos. But yeah, all the painting, all the building, and he could actually build a loco in a week. He once wrote in one of his books that he started a loco one Saturday and painted the buffer beam to finish it off the following Saturday, so he didn't hang about. When he started out, there was very little available by way of scale rail. The initial rail that he could obtain was actually brass, Bonds of Euston Road brass rail, and there are still bits of it left on the layout now in the fiddle yard. It's terrible stuff. It's as soft as anything, and if you touch it with a pair of pliers, it bends in all the wrong places. But he found a way of making his own track using wooden sleepers, plywood sleepers, or with steel pins knocked into them, and then with the rail soldered to the steel pins. He did initially start out using 00, and then in December 1946 Romford brought out an EM gauge axle, and he decided to try it. And basically he used 00 standards, but just with longer axles and the rails further apart. So the track standards are probably a little bit coarse compared to a lot of modern EM and certainly to P4, but they are entirely practical and they have stood the test of time. He made his own wooden gauges, planed wood, and I think he was very pragmatic about such things as track gauge. If he found a place where the track, perhaps wheels were slightly binding around a tight curve or something like that, he would open up the track gauge a bit, and we've found variations. I've measured variations from round about 17.5 to 19.5 millimeters track gauge. EM should be 18.2 millimeters or thereabouts, so it's a bit of a variation. There have been one or two places where we've had a few derailments and things, because apart from the variation in the track gauge, we've also got wheel standards varying from everything from sort of 1940s with great big heavy flanges through to modern Allen Gibson type wheels with relatively small flanges. And so we do have to contend with a sort of fair degree of variation in standards. But most times the layout runs very nicely. He must have had a certain knack of getting good performance out of what was really very primitive equipment. A few of the locos have had new motors over the years. There are some that are running with their original wheels, motors and gears from 65, 70 years ago. And some of them are a little bit noisy, which we can put down to the rather coarse gears that were available at the time. But they do actually run very smoothly, and they respond to the controllers nicely. I did once have a conversation with Peter. I did get to know him a little bit before he sadly passed away, and I had a conversation with him about his locos once, and he didn't like the locos to be too quiet because he couldn't see them start out in the fiddle yard, and he liked to be able to hear when they'd actually started moving. So the noise of the locos didn't worry him too much, but as long as they ran smoothly, and that's certainly what most of them do. Apart from one or two wagons, pretty much all the wagons are sprung and all the carriages are sprung. Most of them have again a homemade internal sprung bearing type arrangement, and they really do glide along the track, and this does help to sort of compensate for the fact that some of the track work standards are not entirely consistent. There are a few little changes in level and a few little kinks here and there, but the springing of the carriages and the wagons does mean that they do glide along the track quite nicely. Starting at the Buckingham end of the layout, the very first scene that you see as you come into the railway shed is a busy market scene. According to the timetable, it's always market day at Buckingham, which gives an excuse for running cattle trains and a fairly intensive service. So there's a market square with some busy stalls and quite a few figures and animals and horse-drawn carriages and things like that around. There's the town hall sort of overlooks the scene. And then you cross a road and you come to the main station building at Buckingham. This particular building, it's not the original Buckingham station building. Very early versions of the station building still survive on Leighton Buzzard now, but this was built sort of round about 1968, 1969. The main station building is based loosely on Marylebone, there's an overall roof. Peter didn't think that the overall roof from Marylebone would be entirely in keeping with the size of the layout, so he looked around and found another one, and the station roof over the platforms is based on Chester Northgate. There's a very imposing goods shed at the back of the station, which is based on one at Attercliffe in Sheffield. He didn't mind bringing in buildings from various different places as long as they complemented the scene and they looked good together. The goods shed itself is actually a Lancashire, Derbyshire and East Coast Railway building, so it wasn't actually originally a Great Central one, but it does fit in and complement the scene. And then as you come down the station, there's a fairly complex station throat with a scissors crossing that's been built on a curve and incorporates slips as well, which is a very imposing bit of track work, and trains look very nice snaking through there. There's an overall bridge and a signal box that's over the tracks. Originally had a smaller signal box until somebody pointed out that it wouldn't have enough levers to work the station, and he didn't have room to put a bigger one on the ground, so he built an overall gantry type signal box. Behind the road bridge and the signal box, there's the start of the gasworks. All three stations on the layout have their own gasworks. He did a lot of research into what a gasworks should look like and what the buildings were and how they should be arranged. And there's a gasworks at each of the stations at Buckingham, at Granborough Junction and at Leighton Buzzard. Again, it's an interesting scenic feature, but it also gives a need for traffic, coal traffic in and out, empties coming out, and gas tanks go in and out as well. And then in the far corner, there's the loco shed, which has a turntable serving a four-road semi-roundhouse. The track work is arranged so that you can get pretty much to any of the platforms to and from the turntable. So there's not too much shuffling about of locos backwards and forwards. And then at the front we've got the goods yard, which is fairly extensive. It includes another goods shed, coal drops, and also a set of wharf sidings serving a timber yard and a small canal wharf. So there's plenty of places for shunting and plenty of suitable sources of traffic for the goods trains. And then once you come round past the carriage sidings, you eventually leave the Buckingham section. There's a small halt just before you go off to Granborough called Bourton Halt, and that's served by a number of the smaller trains. The expresses and the normal local trains don't stop, but the branch trains, they stop at Bourton Halt on the way through to Granborough. And then Granborough Junction, as the name implies, is a junction. There's a split of the lines. The two main lines go off to eventually to Marylebone and to other destinations, in this case the Fiddle Yard. And then there's a single track branch that goes up to Leighton Buzzard, which is the smaller terminus, which we haven't actually got attached to the rest of the layout as yet. That's still work in progress. There's still plenty to keep us busy. But Granborough Junction has 3 platforms, a little loco shed, a goods yard, and also a marshalling yard, 3 or 4 sidings. The goods train comes in from London and is sorted there into its different sidings for different destinations. It's one of the most enjoyable parts of the timetable when the train comes in. And we have a system for shunting the wagons with coloured dots on the soul bars. And we have a little chart that tells us which wagons go where. And it can be a very enjoyable 20 minutes, 25 minutes sorting the goods train out. And then the lines disappear off through Granborough through a shortish scenic section, and then go on either to Leighton Buzzard or the Fiddle Yard, depending on which way the trains are going. It's one of the most interesting parts of the operation, and although it's in a lot of ways it's a historic item, it's a museum piece, but I've had a great deal of joy over the years operating various layouts, and I've had the good luck to operate a number of very good layouts. I've never operated one that is quite so enjoyable to operate as Buckingham. Once you come into the shed on an evening for an operating session, you shut the door, you shut the world outside. You're in Buckingham in 1907, you're the signalman, you're the driver. You have to give it 100% concentration. It's quite challenging to operate. It's certainly not easy, but that's part of the fun. And you have a sequence, a timetable that runs to about 100 movements. There is a clock that we run to more often than not, which is a speeded up clock that does a minute in about 40 seconds. And you're operating with one eye on the clock, and you're looking now, have I got that loco in the right place? The train's due out to platform 2 in another 5 minutes, which is really about another 3 minutes. And the loco that I want, it's pointed the wrong way. I need to get it turned on the turntable. I need to get it off shed onto the train. And you're always trying to make sure that if the time comes round on the clock that you're ready to send that train, or you're ready to receive that train. There are a few little tricks built into the timetable where all of a sudden you'll see, with horse box, and you have to suddenly, where's the horse box? And you have to get the pilot engine out and shunt a horse box across to get it into the platform as soon as possible. The goods trains are particularly interesting to get assembled and ready, and again they're all laid out what goes where and how you do it. And if you come away from the end of an operating session and everything's gone according to plan, and you've got everything in the right place at the right time, it does give you a real sense of satisfaction that everything's gone well. Moving the layout was actually quite a big job. Nobody was more surprised than I was when it was suggested that I should have the layout. I'd been down to Cornwall a few times. I'd met Peter. I can't claim to have been a close friend, but I'd had a few very enjoyable visits down there. I'd done a few little jobs for him, sort of repairing locos and things like that. As he got into his sort of late 80s, little jobs like that were a bit beyond him. And then when the idea came that the layout should come to me, I didn't have anywhere to put it for starters. So we had to arrange to have a shed built, and we actually built the shed ourselves. Crispin Denny is an architect. He designed it and sorted out planning permissions and things. We had 3 trips down to Cornwall altogether, myself and friends, measuring the layout up, dismantling the layout, and then moving it. The dismantling took 3 days because there were just so many bits and pieces that needed to be disconnected, and we had to work out how the thing came apart. It's quite an interesting job when somebody else has built a layout and put it together, and nobody else knows how it comes apart. You're trying to work out, does this bit come off first? Does that bit come off first? Do we do damage if we do this? So it was a fair old task to do it. And then when we got it up to the shed here, assembling it was really too much for me by myself, and I was very glad to have had some help from some very good friends getting it up and running again. But once a good friend had got involved, we got the layout up and running again in about 6 months to the stage that it is now. And then we were faced with a situation where, do we play trains and enjoy what we've got, or do we carry on and finish all the little outstanding jobs? And we decided to enjoy ourselves playing trains, and that was about 4 or 5 years ago now. And there are still a number of little jobs that need finishing off, but we have so much fun playing trains that they don't really matter, and it's not a rush job anyway. I've got plenty of time to do them. I've never seen a layout like it, and I don't expect I ever will again. The points and signals are all operated mechanically through rods and cranks. The electrical systems are so advanced that many a modern layout could learn from them. At Buckingham itself, there's virtually no electrical switching in terms of you actually switching things on and off. All the switching to the platforms and all the running is done by changing the signals, and they either put the power supply from either the Gramborough controller if a train's departing, or from the Buckingham controller if you're shunting, onto the relevant track. So really all you do is you set the point, you set the signals, you turn the controller. There's no thinking about, oh, have I got this section on, have I not got that section on, do I need to switch this, that or the other. All the thinking is done for you in the control systems. All the switches, apart from a few, all the switches are homemade. They're blocks of wood with brass wipers and phosphor bronze wipers sliding on pins, and they do most of the electrical switching. And yes, I've learnt so much about model railways through having this layout. I've probably learnt more about the hobby in the last 5 years since we've been operating Buckingham than I have in the last 30 years put together. It's just so far ahead of its time at the time it was built, and it's still way ahead of a lot of layouts that I see today in terms of the control systems. On the still to be sorted out list is the automatic crispin. This was an electromechanical computer. When Peter used to operate at home with his two sons, or two of his three sons, and when Stephen and Crispin was the last to leave home, Peter found that he didn't enjoy playing trains, sending trains to himself. Stephen was an electrical engineer by trade, and he designed what's known as the automatic crispin, which replaced Crispin as an operator. And basically it's a sort of pianola acetate roll type contraption with a timetable on it. It runs from the clock and operates the fiddle yard, and it can send trains or receive trains either to Gramborough Junction or to Buckingham, depending on how many operators you've got, and you've only got to press one switch on Buckingham to change it from one to the other. And it basically operates the fiddle yard, it sets the points, it offers and receives the block bell codes, puts the electricity onto the right track, and keeps the operator either at Gramborough or Buckingham on his toes, because it doesn't mess about chatting when it's operating. It just gets on with things, and you've always got to be ready for it. It would be nice to get it up and running again one day, and that's eventually the plan, but as I say, it's very, very complicated, and I'm hoping that I might have some help getting that rigged up again before too long.